At 6:30 in the morning, the beach was already alive with noise. Naval guns thundered somewhere offshore, their shells passing overhead with a tearing sound that shook the air. Machine gun fire cracked across the sand in sharp, uneven bursts. Smoke drifted low over the dunes, mixing with salt spray from the cold Mediterranean surf. American infantrymen crouched behind shallow sand embankments along the coast of Morocco. Many of them were barely out of training. Some had never been under fire before this morning. Out of the smoke, enemy tanks began to emerge. Their tracks churned through wet sand. Engines growled steadily, confidently, as the armored vehicles rolled toward the landing zone. Turrets turned slowly, methodically, searching for targets among the scattered American positions. The infantry had no artillery support, no anti-tank guns, just rifles, grenades, and a strange metal tube nearly 5 feet long. They had received the weapon the night before. No training, no instructions, just a promise. Sergeants had handed out the launchers and said only one thing: "This will stop a tank." Now the tanks were closing. 200 yards, then 100. A soldier lifted the tube onto his shoulder. It felt awkward, unfamiliar. He aimed at the lead tank, centered the iron sight on the dark shape of its hull, and squeezed the trigger. Nothing happened. He pulled it again, harder this time. Nothing. All along the beach, other men were doing the same thing, aiming, firing, waiting for something that never came. Tanks kept advancing. Machine guns opened up, bullets tearing through sand and flesh alike. Some soldiers threw the launchers aside and ran. Others hugged the ground, waiting to die. What none of them knew, what no one on that beach could know, was that they had been sent into battle with a weapon that would fail American soldiers for months to come. A weapon meant to change infantry warfare forever. A weapon that, on this beach, did absolutely nothing. For the American Army, the appearance of tanks on that beach was not a surprise. What shocked them was how completely unprepared they were to stop them. 3 years earlier, in September of 1939, German armored divisions had torn through Poland in less than a month. Tanks punched holes through defensive lines, bypassed strongpoints, and left infantry units isolated and helpless. The following spring, the same thing happened in Western Europe. France collapsed. The British Expeditionary Force barely escaped across the Channel. By the summer of 1940, one truth was undeniable. Modern war belonged to armor. The United States watched these events from across the Atlantic with growing concern. On paper, the American Army was expanding rapidly. New divisions were forming. Factories were beginning to turn out weapons by the thousands. But for the infantrymen on the ground, little had changed. If a tank appeared, his options were grim. The standard American anti-tank weapon was the 37-millimeter gun. It was heavy. It required a crew. It had to be towed into position, set up, and aimed, all while enemy armor was already advancing. Against newer tanks with thicker armor, it was often ineffective even when it was in place. There were grenades designed to penetrate armor using shaped charges. They worked, on paper. In reality, they required a soldier to get within 30 yards of a tank, 30 yards of open ground, against a vehicle bristling with machine guns. Army manuals actually described the technique. Run toward the tank, dodge fire, press the grenade against the armor, and hope you lived long enough to get away. This was not a plan. It was desperation written down and distributed. The Army experimented with rifle grenades next, launching shaped charges from the barrel of a standard infantry rifle. But the warheads capable of penetrating armor were too heavy. The recoil was dangerous. Accuracy was poor. Range was limited. Every solution failed for the same reason. Tanks had become too strong, too fast, too lethal, and infantry had been left behind. Inside the Army's Ordnance Corps, a handful of officers were acutely aware of the problem. One of them was Major Leslie Skinner, a career ordnance officer with a reputation for unconventional thinking. Skinner believed the answer was not a bigger gun, it was a rocket. Rockets had one enormous advantage. They could carry heavy warheads without the recoil of a conventional firearm. The explosive force came from the rocket motor, not from a sudden blast in a barrel. The problem was delivery. The Army's most effective anti-tank grenade weighed nearly 4 pounds. No human could throw it accurately, no rifle could launch it safely. And attaching a rocket motor created a new danger. The exhaust could burn or kill the man firing it. For years, Skinner experimented without success. Then, in early 1942, he was given a new assistant. Lieutenant Edward Uhl was 24 years old, an engineering physicist, intelligent, idealistic, and keenly aware that soldiers were about to face German tanks with almost no protection at all. Skinner gave him a simple assignment: find a way for one infantryman to deliver a shaped charge grenade accurately and safely. Do it fast. The war would not wait. Edward Uhl attacked the problem with the urgency of a man who knew lives were already on the clock. He studied everything he could find: rocket propulsion, shaped charges, ignition systems. He built small models. He ran calculations. Every design failed for the same reason. The warhead that could penetrate a tank was simply too heavy. Attach a rocket motor, and the grenade could fly far enough, but the exhaust burned the man firing it. Shields and deflectors added weight and complexity. Mechanical systems meant slow production. The Army needed something simple, something a barely trained soldier could use under fire. Weeks passed with no solution. Then, one afternoon in the spring of 1942, Uhl was walking across Aberdeen proving ground when he noticed a pile of discarded equipment. Bent metal, broken machinery, scraps left behind by earlier experiments. Lying among the debris was a steel tube. It was about 5 feet long, roughly 60 millimeters in diameter. Uhl stopped. 60 millimeters was the exact diameter of the shaped charge grenade they were trying to launch. The idea came together instantly. Put the rocket-propelled grenade inside the tube. Fire it from the shoulder. Let the tube contain the exhaust and direct it safely away from the soldier. No recoil, no burning blast, just a controlled channel for the rocket to do its work. It was almost absurdly simple. Uhl grabbed the tube and rushed back to the workshop. He found Major Skinner and laid out the idea in a breathless rush. Skinner listened carefully, asked a few questions, then nodded. It was worth trying. The first prototype came together quickly. A steel tube was mounted on a crude wooden stock scavenged from a broken rifle. A basic electrical ignition system was added, 2 dry cell batteries wired to contacts inside the tube. A simple iron sight sat on top. The first test firing sent the rocket hissing across the range and into the river beyond. It worked. The exhaust vented cleanly out the rear of the tube. The volunteer who fired it, nervous but unharmed, walked away without a burn or a scratch. For the first time, a single infantryman could deliver a powerful shaped charge safely and accurately. The timing could not have been better. In May 1942, the Army held a competitive trial at Aberdeen. Various anti-tank designs were tested side by side: spigot mortars, recoilless rifles, experimental launchers. Most were heavy, others were inaccurate, some were simply impractical. Skinner and Uhl arrived with their prototype and immediately discovered a problem. They had forgotten to install a proper sight. With minutes to spare before the demonstration, Skinner bent a wire coat hanger into a crude aiming device and attached it to the tube. It would have to do. When the trials began, the improvised launcher outperformed every other design. It was light, it was portable, and it hit moving targets. Senior officers gathered to watch. Among them was Brigadier General Gladian Barnes, head of Army Ordnance Research and Development. Curious, he took the launcher himself and fired. The rocket flew straight. Then he fired again. Within an hour, the decision was made. 5,000 launchers were ordered immediately. Production would begin at once. There would be no delay. Someone remarked that the weapon resembled a strange musical instrument popular on American radio at the time, a homemade horn called a bazooka. The name stuck. Officially, it was designated the M1 rocket launcher. Unofficially, it was rushed headlong into a war that did not allow time for caution. Once the decision was made, everything moved at breakneck speed. The Army wanted 5,000 launchers immediately, not in a year, not after extended testing, now. The order went to General Electric, a company with experience in large-scale manufacturing, but not with a weapon this new, this unproven, or this sensitive. Engineers worked around the clock. Assembly lines were built almost overnight. Materials were sourced wherever they could be found. The priority was not perfection. It was speed. Under normal conditions, each launcher tube would have been carefully measured. Precision bore gauges would ensure the rocket fit perfectly inside, tight enough to seal exhaust gases, loose enough to slide freely when fired. There was no time for that. The gauges themselves would have taken weeks to manufacture, so they were omitted entirely. Tubes came off the line with small variations in diameter, fractions of an inch that seemed insignificant. They were not. If a rocket fit too tightly, it could stick inside the tube. The propellant would continue burning, pressure would build rapidly, something would give. Often, it was the tube itself. Even when rockets did not jam, the steel used for the launchers introduced another danger. Wartime shortages meant manufacturers could not always obtain the specified alloys. Substitutes were used. Some tubes were weaker than intended, especially when heated. In desert sunlight or tropical heat, metal temperatures rose sharply. Rocket propellant burned faster. Internal pressure climbed higher than the thin steel could withstand. A launcher could rupture in the hands of the man firing it. The ignition system added yet another layer of risk. The M1 Bazooka relied on 2 standard dry-cell batteries housed in the wooden shoulder stock. When the trigger was pulled, current flowed through wires to contacts inside the tube, igniting the rocket motor. In theory, it was elegant. In reality, it was fragile. Cold drained battery power, heat caused chemical breakdown, humidity corroded contacts, salt air coated metal surfaces with oxidation that blocked electrical flow. In perfect laboratory conditions, the system worked. On a battlefield, it often did not. The rockets themselves were no more forgiving. The electrical contact on the nose of each round had to align precisely with the launcher's internal contacts. Dirt, corrosion, or slight misalignment could break the circuit completely. A soldier could pull the trigger again and again and hear nothing. Even when rockets did ignite, their behavior was unpredictable. The propellant was sensitive to temperature extremes. In cold conditions, it burned sluggishly. Rockets fell short, wobbling through the air before dropping harmlessly into the ground. In extreme heat, the burn was violent, pressure spiked, launchers failed. And then there was the warhead. The original rocket had a pointed nose designed for aerodynamic efficiency. On a perfect perpendicular hit, the shaped charge detonated correctly. But combat was chaos. Tanks moved, angles changed, shots struck armor at sloping angles. Instead of detonating, rockets sometimes glanced off and ricocheted away. None of these flaws were secrets. They simply had not been discovered yet. There had been no time for extended field testing, no opportunity for soldiers to train, fail, and report problems. The bazooka existed only in controlled demonstrations and hurried paperwork. By the summer of 1942, thousands of launchers and rockets were packed into crates and shipped overseas. They looked identical. They were not, and the men who would carry them into combat had no idea what dangers lay inside the tube resting on their shoulders. The bazooka's first test did not take place on a proving ground. It took place under fire. In November 1942, Operation Torch carried American forces into North Africa. It was the largest amphibious landing the United States had ever attempted. Tens of thousands of men crossed the Atlantic to fight the war for the first time. Among the crates loaded onto transport ships were thousands of brand new M1 bazookas. Most of the men who carried them had never seen one before. On the night before the landings, units opened their crates and discovered unfamiliar metal tubes and odd-looking rockets. There was no time for training. Some crates contained brief instruction sheets, others contained nothing at all. Hours before dawn, General Dwight Eisenhower was informed of something deeply troubling. Not a single unit scheduled to land had received proper instruction on the bazooka. There was nothing he could do. The invasion was already underway. At Fidala Beach and other landing sites along the Moroccan coast, chaos ruled. Men scrambled ashore through surf and smoke. Equipment was dragged through salt water, batteries soaked, contacts corroded almost immediately. When French tanks appeared and began rolling toward the landing zones, infantrymen did what they had been told to do. They raised the launchers, they pulled the triggers. Many heard nothing but silence. Cold morning air drained battery power. Salt spray coated contacts with corrosion. Electrical circuits failed before the first shot was ever fired. Some soldiers reseated rockets, checked wires, and tried again. Nothing. In a few horrifying cases, rockets ignited but failed to leave the tube. Pressure built, metal ruptured, jagged fragments tore into hands, arms, and faces. Men were wounded by the very weapons meant to protect them. Others threw the launchers aside and picked up rifles instead. The bazooka's combat debut was a disaster. No confirmed tank kills were recorded during the landings. But the worst was yet to come. In February 1943, American forces advancing into Tunisia met the German Afrika Korps for the first time at a place called Kasserine Pass. The terrain was unforgiving. Narrow mountain passes, limited visibility, perfect ground for armored attack. German panzer divisions advanced with confidence. Among them were heavy Tiger tanks, machines American troops had never faced before. 2 days earlier, many units had received their first shipment of bazookas. 2 days was all they had. When German armor attacked, American infantry attempted to fight back. Bazooka teams took positions and waited until the tanks were close enough to hit. They aimed. They fired. Most rockets did not ignite. Some bounced harmlessly off sloped armor. Others jammed inside launchers, forcing soldiers to drop the weapons and run. Those who hesitated were sometimes killed by exploding tubes. Against Tiger tanks, even functioning rockets were often ineffective. The shaped charge detonated but failed to penetrate the thick frontal armor. Crews watched in disbelief as their shots left nothing but scorched marks on steel. German tanks kept coming. The result was catastrophic. American units broke and retreated. Thousands were killed, wounded, or captured. Equipment was abandoned. Confidence collapsed. Kasserine Pass became one of the most humiliating defeats in U.S. Army history. Field reports flooded back to Army ordnance. The message was clear. The weapon was unreliable. The rockets were defective. The troops did not trust the bazooka. And now the Germans had something else. They had captured entire crates of unused American launchers. The Germans did not dismiss the bazooka as a failure. They examined it. After Kasserine Pass, German units collected dozens of abandoned American launchers. Many were unused. Some were still sealed in their original crates. To German engineers, this alone was revealing. A weapon that American soldiers had not trusted was clearly important enough to be issued in large numbers. Captured bazookas were sent back to Germany for evaluation. Engineers disassembled them carefully, studying every component: the steel tube, the ignition system, the rocket motor, the shaped charge warhead. They immediately understood the idea. A lightweight, shoulder-fired rocket launcher was exactly what modern infantry needed. The concept was sound. The execution was not. German engineers identified the problems quickly. Battery ignition was unreliable. Electrical contacts were vulnerable. The rocket's diameter was too small to deliver maximum penetration. The pointed nose made the warhead prone to ricochet. And most dangerously, the American launcher offered no protection to the man firing it. Rather than abandon the design, the Germans rebuilt it. They increased the caliber of the rocket, allowing for a larger-shaped charge capable of penetrating thicker armor. They replaced the battery ignition with a magneto system, a mechanical generator activated by the trigger itself. It worked in heat, it worked in cold, it worked in rain, dust, and mud. They added a blast shield to protect the operator's face from exhaust gases. They reinforced the tube to handle higher pressures. They redesigned the warhead nose to improve detonation angles. The result was a weapon that looked unmistakably familiar, and yet fundamentally different. The Germans named it the Raketenpanzerbüchse. Allied soldiers would come to know it by another name, the Panzerschreck. On the battlefield, it proved devastating. German infantry could now engage Allied armor at close range with confidence. Shermans burned, crews bailed out. For American soldiers, the irony was bitter. They were being fired upon by a perfected version of their own idea. Reports of the Panzerschreck filtered back to American commands in Europe and North Africa. Intelligence officers studied photographs. Engineers read field reports in disbelief. The enemy had taken the bazooka seriously, and in doing so, they had exposed just how badly the original weapon had failed. Back in the United States, Army ordnance could no longer ignore the evidence. The bazooka did not need replacement, it needed fixing. By the spring of 1943, the verdict was unavoidable. The bazooka was not a bad idea. It was a bad execution. Back in the United States, reports from North Africa landed on the desks of Army ordnance officers in alarming numbers. Field commanders complained of weapons that failed to fire. Medical units reported burns, fractures, and shrapnel wounds caused by ruptured launchers. Infantry officers warned that their men no longer trusted the weapon at all. Trust, once lost in combat, was difficult to recover. The M1 launcher was quietly withdrawn from frontline service. Engineers were given a new mandate. This time, there would be no shortcuts. The first change was ignition. The battery system was abandoned entirely. In its place came a magneto-ignition, mechanical, self-contained, activated by the trigger itself. No batteries, no wires exposed to moisture. If the trigger moved, the rocket fired. Next came the tube. The launcher was reinforced to handle higher internal pressures. Manufacturing tolerances were tightened. Bore dimensions were standardized. Rockets would no longer jam or overheat inside the tube. The warhead was redesigned as well. The pointed nose was replaced with a blunt profile that improved detonation reliability on angled armor. Penetration increased. Consistency improved. The result was the M1A1 bazooka. It was heavier than its predecessor, slightly more awkward, but it worked. Later refinements produced the M9, with improved sights, better balance, and a collapsible tube for easier transport. Each change reflected lessons learned the hard way. When the revised bazookas returned to combat zones, the difference was immediate. In Sicily, American infantry encountered enemy armor again. This time, when bazooka teams fired, rockets left the tube. Warheads detonated. Light and medium tanks were knocked out at close range. In Italy, the weapon found a new role. German fortifications dotted hillsides and towns. Concrete bunkers and machine gun nests resisted rifle and artillery fire alike. Bazookas punched holes through walls and firing slits. Infantry advanced behind the blasts. The launcher became less about killing tanks and more about breaking defenses. In the Pacific, the transformation was even more pronounced. Japanese tanks were lighter, but heavily dug-in positions posed the real threat. Bazookas proved devastating against bunkers, caves, and log fortifications. Entire defensive positions collapsed under direct rocket fire. Infantry doctrine adapted accordingly. The bazooka was no longer treated as a miracle weapon. It was treated as a tool, a dangerous one, a limited one, but a reliable one. By the time American forces landed in Normandy, bazooka teams were fully integrated into infantry units. Soldiers trained extensively. Safety procedures were enforced. Expectations were realistic. The weapon that had once betrayed them had finally earned their confidence. But that confidence came at a price. Men at Fidala, men at Kasserine. They had paid for every lesson written into the metal and wiring of the improved bazooka. By the final years of the war, the bazooka was no longer new. It was simply there. Every American infantry unit expected to have one. Soldiers trained with it, planned around it, carried it as a matter of routine. What had once been an untrusted experiment had become a standard part of modern warfare. In Normandy, bazooka teams moved cautiously through hedgerows, waiting for the sound of engines. In the ruined cities of Europe, they fired down streets and into shattered buildings. In the Pacific, they blasted bunkers from coral ridges and jungle slopes. The weapon was never perfect. Against the heaviest German armor, it remained limited. Crews still needed courage, patience, and luck to get close enough for a disabling shot. But now, when the trigger was pulled, the rocket fired. That alone changed everything. After the war, the lessons endured. The bazooka became the foundation for an entire class of infantry weapons. Larger launchers followed, more powerful rockets, improved warheads. The super bazooka would see combat in Korea, capable of defeating tanks that dwarfed anything encountered in North Africa. Other nations followed the same path, the Germans' Panzerschreck, the British Piat. Later generations of rocket launchers across the world all traced their lineage back to a simple idea born from desperation and hurried into combat too soon. Yet behind every improvement lay a cost that never appeared in technical manuals. The cost was paid by soldiers who trusted equipment that failed them, men who raised launchers on beaches and in mountain passes, believing they had been given a fighting chance, only to discover they had not. Their experiences reshaped doctrine, forced caution, demanded testing. Lives became the argument that engineers could no longer ignore. War has always driven innovation, but it does not forgive shortcuts. The bazooka story is not one of triumph alone. It is a reminder that weapons are not proven in workshops or demonstrations. They are proven in the hands of frightened men, under fire, with no margin for error. And when they fail, the consequences are immediate. For those who survived Fadala and Kasserine, the later success of the bazooka came too late to erase the memory of silence when a trigger was pulled. What remained was a hard-earned truth, one written into every improved launcher that followed. In war, progress is measured not only by what works, but by who paid for the lessons along the way.